Hello, everyone. I am the sleep storyteller, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before we begin, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps out a lot. Also, let me know in the comments, where are you from and what time are you listening? Now get comfortable and relax. The rain drummed softly against the crooked windows of the burrow, streaking down in silver rivulets that shimmered in the dim glow of the hearth. Outside, the countryside lay wrapped in mist, the fields stretching dark and endless beneath the weight of the storm. The house, ever warm and filled with life, felt unusually still tonight, as if even its very walls were holding their breath. Ron Weasley sat slouched in an old armchair, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames, watching as shadows danced along the worn wooden walls. The scent of burning logs filled the air, familiar, comforting, but it did nothing to ease the restlessness that curled in his chest like an ember refusing to die. His fingers idly traced the frayed fabric of the armrest, lost in thought. It had been 3 years. 3 years since the war had ended, since Voldemort had fallen, since the world had been set right again. And yet, somehow, he still felt like a puzzle piece left out of the final picture. Harry had slipped into his role effortlessly, stepping into the ministry as an Auror, his name carrying the weight of a legend still in the making. Hermione, of course, was reshaping the wizarding world one parchment at a time, her voice cutting through old traditions and outdated laws with a force that left no room for argument. They had a path, a purpose, and Ron had a lingering sense of something unfinished, something missing. A gust of wind rattled the window panes, making the old house groan in protest. Ron exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his hair. The fire crackled louder, as if in response, and then, brooding again, Ginny's voice cut through the silence, light and teasing, though laced with something knowing. She stood in the doorway, still damp from flying, her broom slung over one shoulder. A flick of her wand sent droplets spiraling from her robes, vanishing before they touched the floor. She crossed the room and flopped into the chair opposite him, stretching out her legs. "I'm not brooding," Ron muttered, though he wasn't entirely convinced of his own words. Ginny smirked. "Right, you've got that woe is me face on again. You only look like that when you're about to make a terrible life decision, or when you realize you left your chocolate frogs in the sun." Ron scowled, but the corners of his mouth twitched. "I'm just thinking. A dangerous pastime." Ron rolled his eyes, but leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Do you remember Mum ever mentioning an ancestor named Gideon Weasley?" Ginny's brow furrowed. "Uncle Gideon?" "No, someone older." She shook her head. "Never heard of him." Ron hesitated. The name had surfaced unexpectedly while he was helping Hermione sort through old ministry records. A name that, at first, should have meant nothing. And yet, it had tugged at something deep within him. There was almost nothing on Gideon Weasley, just a few vague mentions of magical creature hunting, long before the ministry had even existed. A Weasley whose name should have been woven into their family's history, yet instead lingered on the edges like a whisper half erased. "You found something, didn't you?" Ginny asked, watching him closely. Ron exhaled through his nose. "I don't know, maybe. It's just weird." Ginny tilted her head. "Weird how?" "It's like he was important, but no one talks about him. Like he just vanished." Ginny leaned back, crossing her arms. "Maybe there's a reason no one talks about him." That thought lingered long after Ginny had gone to bed, long after the fire had burned low, and the rain had softened into a gentle drizzle. The burrow was silent, save for the occasional creak of old wood settling. But Ron found himself unable to sleep. Instead, he stood before the entrance to the attic, the narrow staircase looming ahead, filled with shadows that stretched long in the dim candlelight. His pulse thrummed in his ears. He wasn't sure what he expected to find. Perhaps just old records, forgotten books, the usual clutter of generations past. But something inside him whispered that there was more, that something had been left behind for him to uncover. Slowly, he pushed the door open. The attic smelled of dust and time, thick with the scent of parchment and mothballs. Piles of books lay stacked against old trunks, broken furniture scattered in forgotten corners. A faint draft stirred the dust, making it swirl in the dim glow of his wand light. Ron stepped carefully, the wooden floorboards groaning beneath his weight, his eyes scanning the clutter. There, half buried beneath a tangle of old robes, a small wooden box rested, its surface smooth with age. The latch was rusted, but it gave way with a soft click. Inside, nestled against faded velvet, was an amulet, heavy, cold. Its surface was etched with runes Ron didn't recognize, twisting like vines across the tarnished metal. A faint warmth pulsed from it, as if holding the last ember of a dying fire. Beside it, folded with careful precision, lay a piece of parchment. He picked it up, unfolding it gently. The ink was faded, but the words were still legible. Gideon Weasley, protector of Roth Farley. The amulet is bound to blood. Guard against the shadows. Roth Farley. The name stirred something in the back of Ron's mind, like a half-forgotten dream. Not just a name, a place. One he had seen before, somewhere in the margins of an old book, buried in the depths of some forgotten record. A chill passed through him, settling deep in his bones. The amulet in his hand seemed to hum softly, as if responding to his touch. Ron swallowed hard. He didn't know why, but he was certain of one thing. This was only the beginning. The attic felt heavier now, as though the very air had thickened with something unseen, something waiting. The warmth from the amulet in Ron's palm was unmistakable. A slow, steady pulse, like a second heartbeat. He turned it over, his fingers tracing the intricate runes carved into its surface, runes that didn't quite sit still, shifting ever so slightly in the dim glow of his wand. It was heavier than it looked, its weight solid and absolute, as if it carried something more than mere metal. quiet promise, a buried truth. Ron exhaled, steadying himself as the wind rattled the old beams above. He'd never liked the attic much, not because of the dust or the clutter, but because it always felt full. Not in the way of an overcrowded room, but as though the weight of the past pressed down on everything here, lingering in the corners, waiting to be noticed. He had spent his childhood avoiding this place, darting up only when his mum sent him on errands, eager to escape the musty silence. But now, standing amidst relics of a time long past, he felt something different. A pull, a thread winding itself around his ribs, tugging him deeper into his own history. The name on the parchment whispered at the edges of his mind. Gideon Weasley, protector of Roth Farley. Who was he? And why had his name been scrubbed from history? The thought sat uneasily in Ron's chest as he carefully folded the parchment and tucked it into his pocket. The amulet, however, he hesitated before slipping the chain over his head. The moment it touched his skin, a quiet warmth spread from it, not unpleasant, but undeniable. Almost like recognition. Shaking off the creeping unease, he made his way back down the narrow staircase, each step creaking under his weight. The house was silent, wrapped in the deep hush of early morning, the kind of quiet that settled only when everyone was truly asleep. But as he stepped into the kitchen, he realized he wasn't alone. Ginny was still awake. She sat at the kitchen table, legs propped up on another chair, a steaming cup of tea resting between her hands. Her hair, still damp from earlier, fell in loose waves over her shoulders. She didn't look surprised to see him. In fact, she barely glanced up, only arching an eyebrow in acknowledgement before taking a slow sip of her tea. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she murmured, her voice calm but sharp as ever. Ron hesitated for a moment before pulling out the chair across from her and sitting down. "Maybe I have." Ginny finally set her cup down, her sharp gaze locking onto his. She had always been good at this, waiting, watching, letting the silence stretch just enough to pull the truth out of someone. It was a skill she had honed growing up in a house full of brothers, where being overlooked was easy if you let it happen. Ron exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. "I found something," he admitted, his voice quieter than he meant it to be, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the moment. "Something about an ancestor of ours, Gideon Weasley." Ginny frowned. "Never heard of him." "That's the thing," Ron said, leaning forward. "No one has. Not in the family, not in any of Mum's stories. But he was important. Really important. Some kind of magical creature hunter. But there's almost nothing about him. No records, no mentions in any history books." He hesitated. "It's like someone wanted him to be forgotten." Ginny studied him, her fingers tapping idly against her cup. "And you think that means something?" Ron swallowed. His hand brushed over the amulet where it rested against his chest, its warmth steady and present. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I found this." He pulled the pendant from beneath his shirt, letting it rest between them on the table. The dim light of the kitchen caught on the runes, making them gleam faintly, like reflections on water. Ginny leaned in, her brow furrowing as she ran a finger lightly over the markings. "That's old magic," she murmured. "Not just some trinket. You can feel it." Ron nodded. "Yeah, I can." Ginny leaned back, considering him. Then, after a long moment, she asked, "So what are you going to do about it?" Ron swallowed. He hadn't thought that far ahead, not really. But now, sitting here in the dim glow of the kitchen, feeling the weight of the amulet in his hands, the only answer that made sense was the one that had been building inside him since the moment he found it. "I'm going to find out who he was," Ron said. For the first time in a long while, something inside him settled into place. A pull, a purpose, something that was his. Not Harry's, not Hermione's. His. Ginny held his gaze for a moment before a small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. Not teasing this time. Something softer. Understanding. "Good," she said simply, taking another sip of her tea. "I guess you better get some sleep then. You've got a journey ahead of you, big brother." Ron huffed a quiet laugh, shaking his head. But as he glanced down at the amulet once more, feeling its warmth against his skin, he knew she was right. Because this wasn't just about family history anymore. This was something bigger, something waiting to be found. And for once, Ron wasn't going to stand in the background. This time, he was going to find the truth. The burrow had always been a place of warmth, a haven built from mismatched bricks and well-worn wood, layered with the scent of fresh bread and old parchment. Even in the dead of night, when the house itself seemed to breathe in slow, steady rhythms, it never felt empty. But as Ron stood by his bedroom window, staring out at the mist-covered fields, he felt like a stranger inside his own home. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained heavy with retreating storm clouds, their dark bellies hanging low over the hills. A thin mist curled over the fields, slithering between the orchard trees, creeping through the long grass as if alive. The trees stood still, their rain-slicked branches weighed down by the night's lingering dampness. And beyond them, the world stretched dark and endless, waiting. Ron tightened his grip on the amulet hanging from his neck, its weight pressing solidly against his chest. The runes, though ancient and worn, never seemed to settle into one shape. When he turned the pendant slightly in the candlelight, the carvings shimmered, subtle, shifting. Almost alive. His thumb brushed over the metal surface. A name, a place, a buried story. It wasn't just about the amulet. It wasn't even just about Gideon Weasley. It was about something else. Something missing. The thought festered, twisting inside him like a creeping vine, thick and tangled. What if this was all he would ever be? He had told himself it didn't matter. He had spent years laughing off the idea that he was somehow lesser, building walls around the quiet ache of standing in someone else's shadow. He had learned how to play his part, the funny one, the loyal friend, the steadfast support. It was easier that way. Easier than admitting that sometimes, when the world spoke of heroes, he was always just the name mentioned in passing. Not Harry, not Hermione, just Ron. His fingers curled tighter around the pendant. He needed to leave. The thought struck hard and sudden, like a jolt of electricity up his spine. He couldn't stay here, not now, not with this thing gnawing at him from the inside out. He had to go to Roth Farley, had to find out why Gideon Weasley had been erased from history, had to understand why this amulet felt like it had been waiting for him. And maybe, just maybe, he needed to prove something to himself. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the branches, sending leaves skittering against the window pane. The candle on his desk flickered violently, its flame twisting as if the very room could feel the decision settling into his bones. Ron turned from the window and moved quickly. His hands worked on instinct, pulling open drawers, shoving clothes into his rucksack, grabbing his wand, his cloak, a handful of galleons. And then, last of all, the amulet. He slipped the chain over his head, tucking the pendant beneath his shirt, feeling its weight settle over his heart. He took a deep breath and stepped out into the hallway. The house was still, silent. Only the faint crackle of dying embers in the hearth below and the distant hoot of an owl broke the hush. He stepped carefully, his feet avoiding the floorboards he knew would creak. As he passed Ginny's door, he hesitated for just a moment. She had given him her blessing in the only way Ginny ever did, with sharp words and knowing eyes. But still, he hesitated. He would tell her later. The stairs groaned softly under his weight as he descended into the kitchen. Shadows stretched long across the walls, flickering with the golden light of the dying fire. The scent of tea still lingered in the air, mingling with the damp earth outside. His gaze flickered to the old family photographs along the walls. His parents, his siblings, smiling faces frozen in time. Mid-laughter, mid-movement. The lump in his throat was unexpected. He wasn't leaving forever, but he had to go. The front door creaked as he pushed it open, stepping onto the porch. The night air was thick with the scent of wet earth and old rain. A cold breeze slipped beneath his cloak, curling against his skin. Before him, the path stretched dark and unknown. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and stepped forward. The road to Roth Farley was waiting, and for the first time in his life, Ron Weasley wasn't following anyone else's footsteps. He was walking into the unknown alone. The night swallowed him whole. Ron walked with purpose, his boots pressing into the damp earth, the mist curling around his ankles as though trying to pull him back. The road beyond the burrow was familiar at first, winding through hills he had known since childhood, past stone fences worn smooth by time, past old, gnarled trees that had watched over the Weasleys for generations. But the further he went, the more the landscape seemed to shift. The air grew colder, trees thickened, their branches arching overhead like silent sentinels. The wind carried the scent of damp moss and wood smoke, mingling with something older, something he couldn't quite name. Rothfarley was far to the north, past the edge of the known wizarding world, tucked away in the forgotten corners of history. Ron wasn't even sure how he knew that, only that when he had read the name, when he had seen the words "Protector of Rothfarley," something inside him had stirred. The amulet pulsed with warmth against his chest. He walked through the night, his senses sharpening as the hours stretched on. He barely noticed the passage of time, only that the stars had shifted above him, the deep indigo of the sky beginning to lighten at the edges. Mist clung to the ground, thick and heavy, creeping over the road like fingers searching for something lost. By the time he reached the village, dawn was breaking. Rothfarley. The first sign of it was a weathered wooden signpost, its lettering so faded it was barely legible. Beyond that, an old stone bridge stretched over a narrow, slow-moving river. The surface of the water rippled beneath the breeze, dark and endless, its depths unknowable. Ron paused there for a moment, leaning against the damp stone railing, listening to the world around him. It was quiet, too quiet. Not the quiet of a village merely at rest, but the kind of silence that pressed against the skin. The kind of silence that came when a place had been abandoned, or worse, when something had taken its breath away. He pushed forward. The village itself was old. Older than anything he had seen before, its cobbled streets winding unpredictably, its buildings hunched and weathered, leaning toward each other as if whispering secrets. The wooden beams were dark with age, the rooftops steep and sloping, their chimneys stretching into the mist like skeletal fingers. And it felt wrong, not cursed, not like dark magic had tainted the land. But there was something unsettling in the way the village sat, as if it had once been full of life, and then, one day, everything had simply stopped. Ron walked slowly, his boots echoing against the cobblestones. He caught glimpses of movement in the shuttered windows, of curtains shifting just as he passed. Rothfarley was not completely abandoned, but the people here were not eager to be seen. A single light flickered in the distance, a lantern swaying gently above the entrance to what appeared to be an inn. It was one of the few buildings that looked maintained, its wooden sign creaking softly in the breeze. Ron stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of old wood, damp wool, and the faint trace of pipe smoke. The inn's main room was dimly lit, mostly empty save for a single man slouched by the hearth, his back turned to Ron, his fingers curled around a half-finished drink. Behind the counter, a woman stood wiping down the bar. She looked up the moment Ron entered, her gaze sharp and assessing. "You're new." Ron nodded, pulling off his cloak and shaking the rain from its edges. "Just arrived." The woman studied him for a long moment, her eyes flicking down, just for an instant, to the amulet resting against his chest. her fingers tightened around the cloth in her hands. If she recognized it, she said nothing. Instead, she nodded toward the empty tables. "Rooms are upstairs if you're staying. I'll need coin." Ron hesitated, then stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I'm looking for something." The woman's expression didn't change, but the way she set down the cloth, the slow, careful movement of it, told him that she was bracing for whatever came next. "Or someone," Ron continued. "Gideon Weasley. Ever heard of him?" The air in the room shifted. The low crackling of the fire became the only sound, its amber glow barely reaching the corners of the inn, its flickering light casting uneasy shadows against the wooden walls. The woman inhaled slowly, measured. "If you've got any sense," she said, her voice quieter now, deliberate, "you'll stop looking." Ron's fingers brushed over the amulet. He had come too far for that. The weight of the woman's words settled over the room like dust, thick and unmoving. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, but its warmth did little to chase away the creeping chill that coiled through Ron's bones. He held her gaze, his fingers instinctively curling around the edge of the bar, steadying himself. "I've come too far to stop looking now," he said, his voice quieter but firm. For a moment, the woman didn't respond. She simply watched him, the way someone might watch an oncoming storm knowing they couldn't stop it, only brace for what was coming. Then, slowly, she exhaled through her nose, shaking her head. "You don't know what you're asking." She reached for a glass behind the bar, poured herself a drink with slow, practiced movements, but didn't take a sip. Instead, she turned the glass between her fingers, staring at the counter as if looking through it, seeing something beyond the present. "This place," she said finally, her voice quieter, heavier. "Roth Farley. People don't come here to look for things. They come here to forget, to disappear." Her gaze flicked back to him, and there was something sharp in her eyes now. "You're the first outsider I've seen in years asking about the past, and that makes you dangerous." Ron let out a slow breath, his fingers brushing over the amulet where it rested beneath his shirt. "I don't want to cause trouble," he said, though even he wasn't sure that was entirely true. "I just need to understand why my ancestor was erased from history, why there's nothing left of him but a whisper." The woman exhaled sharply, rubbing her hands over her face, not with frustration, but with resignation, as if this moment had been inevitable, as if she had been waiting for someone to come asking, whether she wanted them to or not. She set the glass down and finally looked him in the eye. Gideon Weasley was the last man who ever tried to save this place, she said. And he failed. Ron's breath caught in his throat. Failed how? She tapped her fingers against the wooden counter, a slow, rhythmic sound. You think this village just died because people moved away? Because time forgot it? She shook her head. No, Roth Farley wasn't lost. It was taken. Ron's pulse pounded against his ribs. Taken by what? The woman hesitated, her lips pressing together. Her fingers curled against the counter, as if she could grip something solid in the shifting, uncertain space of memory. And then, finally, she spoke. They called it the bear. The words sent a shiver through Ron's spine, though he couldn't say why. It wasn't a bear, she added, her voice lower now, measured, as though speaking too loudly might wake something long asleep. Not really. But people need names for things, need something to call their fears. The truth is, it was worse than that. Ron swallowed, his grip on the bar tightening. What was it? The woman's gaze drifted past him, toward the window, toward the mist-choked streets outside. The village lay in silence beyond the glass, the cobbled roads swallowed by the creeping fog. But even in the stillness, Ron could feel it, the weight of something unseen pressing against the edges of the world, waiting. They used to say it had always been here, she murmured. That it had been sleeping beneath the hills long before the first stones of Roth Farley were laid. It wasn't born like other things, not of flesh and blood. It was made of hunger, made of shadow. It slipped through the cracks of the world and rooted itself here, wrapped its claws around this land, and never let go. Ron's stomach tightened. He had seen monsters before, had fought against the darkness lurking in the hidden places of the world. But this was different. This wasn't just a creature. This was something worse. What did it do? He asked, his voice quieter now, an edge creeping into it. The woman exhaled through her nose, shaking her head. It took what? People, memories, time. She tapped the side of her head. It didn't just kill Ron Weasley. It erased Asterisk, like it was feeding on more than just flesh, like it was feeding on the very idea of you. Ron's grip tightened on the amulet. That explained Gideon. Explained why his name had nearly been wiped from history. He had fought something that wasn't just a beast, but a force. And it had won. The woman's expression darkened. Gideon tried to stop it. Tried the way all heroes try wand and courage, fire and blood. And for a time, it seemed like he had. She swallowed. He sealed it away, locked it beneath the earth with magic older than this village itself. Magic that should have held it forever. Ron's jaw clenched. He already knew where this was going. But nothing lasts forever, she finished. And some doors, once closed, don't stay shut. A cold shudder ran through him. It's waking up, he murmured. The woman met his gaze, and there was no doubt in her eyes now. No hesitation, no softening of the truth. It never truly slept, she whispered. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. The mist curled in the streets like a living thing, creeping toward the inn, pressing against the glass. And for the first time, Ron understood. This wasn't just about the past. This was about now. The fire burned low in the hearth, its light barely reaching the corners of the inn, where the shadows stretched long and still. The woman across from Ron had fallen silent, her fingers resting against the countertop, tense, as though bracing herself against the weight of the truth she had just spoken. Ron swallowed hard, his pulse a steady thud against his ribs. The amulet was warm against his skin, the steady pulse of it stronger now, as if it too had heard the warning in her words. It never truly slept. The wind outside howled through the streets, rattling the wooden shutters, slipping through the cracks of the inn's old bones. Ron exhaled slowly, steadying himself, his fingers tightening around the edge of the bar. If it's still here, he said carefully, then why hasn't it taken more? The woman finished for him, raising an eyebrow. Ron nodded. The woman exhaled, reaching for the drink she had poured earlier, rolling the glass between her fingers. Because something held it back, she murmured, for a while. Maybe it was Gideon's magic. Maybe it was the fact that there weren't many left to take. She glanced toward the window, where the mist curled thick against the glass. Or maybe it was waiting. Ron frowned, waiting for what? She met his gaze then, and he felt the cold weight of her stare settle over him. For you. The words struck like a hammer, sharp and undeniable. A cold rush spread through Ron's chest, though he forced himself to stay still, to keep his breathing even. The woman's expression didn't waver. Blood calls to blood, Ron Weasley. And you, her gaze flickered to the amulet still resting against his chest. You carry the same fire in your veins that Gideon did. Ron exhaled sharply, shaking his head. No, that doesn't make sense. I didn't even know about Gideon before yesterday. I only came here because something pulled asterisk you hear, the woman interrupted. Her voice was calm, measured, but there was something beneath it, something close to pity. You could have ignored it, could have let it go, but you didn't. And that's because it wasn't just the past calling to you. Ron's grip tightened on the amulet. He wanted to argue, to tell her that was ridiculous. That magic didn't work like that. Except he wasn't sure if that was true. Because deep down, in the quiet parts of himself, he knew. The pull had been there from the moment he'd read Gideon's name. From the moment he had found the amulet, felt its weight in his hands, its warmth against his skin. It hadn't been a choice. Not really. It had been waiting for him. Ron exhaled slowly, forcing himself to focus. So if I'm here, then what? It wakes up, and what? Comes for me. The woman's expression darkened. No, she murmured. It's already awake. A sharp gust of wind slammed against the windows, shaking the wooden beams of the inn. The lanterns swayed, their flames flickering wildly before steadying again. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Ron felt it then. A presence. Not in the room. Not yet. But outside, pressing in from the mist-laden streets, curling around the buildings, seeping through the cracks of the world itself. Watching. Waiting. He stood abruptly, pushing back from the bar, his pulse hammering in his ears. Where is it? His voice was low, steady, but he could feel the energy shifting around him, the air growing heavier. The woman hesitated for only a moment before nodding toward the far end of the village. "The ruins," she said. "That's where Gideon faced it. That's where he fell. That's where it waits." Ron's jaw clenched. His fingers curled tighter around the amulet, feeling the steady warmth pulsing against his skin. He had come here for answers. Now he was walking into something much bigger than history. He turned toward the door, bracing himself. The moment his hand touched the worn brass handle, the woman spoke again. "Ron." He paused, glancing back. Her gaze was softer now. "Not all stories end in victory," she said quietly. "Some are meant to be warnings." Ron held her stare for a long moment before nodding once. Then he stepped into the night. The air was damp and thick with fog, the cold seeping through his cloak, curling against his skin. The village was silent, its narrow streets swallowed by the creeping mist, the buildings leaning in like whispering figures. The road stretched before him, winding toward the far end of Roth Farley, toward the ruins, toward the thing that had been waiting for him. The night pressed in around Ron as he moved through the silent streets of Roth Farley. The mist thickened with every step, curling around his boots, stretching long and pale over the cobblestones like ghostly fingers reaching for him. The village behind him was swallowed by the fog, its lantern lights fading into distant pinpricks, barely visible through the shifting gray. And ahead, the ruins loomed. They stood at the far edge of the village, half hidden by the mist, crumbling remains of what had once been something grand. Stone walls jutted from the ground like jagged teeth, slick with moisture, their edges worn smooth by time. Ivy curled over fallen beams, the skeletal remains of wooden doors clinging to rusted hinges. The earth beneath his feet turned uneven, damp with the weight of long-forgotten history. The amulet at his chest pulsed, not just with warmth now, but with something stronger, something urgent. Ron's hand instinctively tightened around his wand. The wind shifted, the mist stirred. He wasn't alone. The air changed, thickening like the moment before a storm. The silence deepened, pressing against his ears, muting even the faintest of sounds. No birds, no rustling of leaves, no whisper of distant movement, just stillness, waiting. Ron exhaled, steadying himself as he stepped forward. The ruins stretched wide before him, yawning like an open mouth. There was something here, something unseen, yet undeniably present. And then a sound, a low, distant asterisk rumble asterisk. Not thunder, not wind, something deeper, something alive. Ron's breath came slow and measured. His fingers curled tighter around his wand as he scanned the darkness, the mist swirling unpredictably, shifting and parting like something was moving within it. And then, just at the edge of his vision, he saw them. Footprints, appearing one by one in the damp earth, just ahead of him. But there was nothing making them. Ron's pulse pounded. The footprints were large, asterisk too large. The shape of them wasn't quite human, not quite animal, something in between, and they were moving, slowly, deliberately, coming toward him. A sharp chill ran through him. He had fought things before: Death Eaters, acromantulas, cursed creatures lurking in the shadows of the forbidden forest. But this was something else. This wasn't just a monster. This was something that shouldn't exist. The amulet burned against his chest. A whisper curled through the mist, so faint he almost thought he imagined it. Blood calls to blood. Ron took a slow, steadying breath, his grip firm around his wand. Lumos. The tip of his wand ignited, casting a pale glow through the swirling fog. The footprints stretched ahead of him, leading deeper into the ruins. The mist seemed to recoil from the light, curling away from the edges, revealing more of the crumbling structures, the forgotten bones of a place lost to time. Then movement, a shadow, a shifting shape at the very edge of his vision, something asterisk big. Ron's breath hitched. His instincts screamed at him to move, to run, but his feet stayed planted. He forced himself to stand his ground, to listen past the hammering of his own heartbeat. The wind picked up, and then, from the darkness, a pair of asterisk eyes, deep, burning gold, flickering like embers, watching him. A low, guttural sound rippled through the night, more felt than heard, reverberating through the stones, the earth, the very air itself. Ron swallowed hard. The bear. It wasn't just legend. It was real, and it had been waiting for him. The golden eyes burned in the darkness, unblinking, watching, measuring. The mist curled thick around the ruins, shifting like breath. But Ron stood his ground, his pulse hammering. The warmth of the amulet flared against his chest, no longer just a slow pulse, but a steady thrum, like something alive, something responding. The air between them was charged, the silence thick with unseen weight. The creature didn't move. Neither did Ron. Then a step, not his. The ground trembled ever so slightly, the damp earth shifting as something massive moved within the mist. The shape wasn't entirely clear, more shadow than substance, more presence than form. It loomed just beyond the reach of his wand light, its edges blurred by the curling fog, but the eyes remained, glowing, fixed on him. Ron swallowed, his grip tightening on his wand. He didn't dare speak, didn't dare move. He had faced many things before: spells that could kill in an instant, beasts that lurked in the dark. But this was something else. A force, a remnant of something ancient. A deep, slow breath stirred the mist, not his own. Then a voice. Not a voice in the way people spoke, not sound carried through the air. It was deeper than that, asterisk inside his bones, inside his head, pressing against the edges of his thoughts. You are not him. Ron stiffened, a chill rippling through him. The words weren't a question. They were a statement, layered with something unreadable disappointment. Recognition. The weight of the creature's presence pressed down on him, heavy as stone. You wear his mark. The amulet at his chest burned hotter. Ron forced himself to breathe, to steady his thoughts. "Gideon Weasley," he said, his voice firm, though quieter than he intended. "You knew him." A long, shuddering pause. Then, laughter, but it wasn't laughter in the way people laughed. It was an asterisk sound asterisk. Something guttural, something old, something laced with something that might have once been amusement, but had long since rotted into something else. Knew him. The mist shifted. I ended him. Ron's stomach dropped. His pulse roared in his ears, but he didn't let himself flinch. He forced himself to stay still, to meet those burning eyes, even as the weight of those words settled over him. This thing, this force, had killed Gideon, the man who had tried to stop it, the protector of Roth Farley. Ron clenched his jaw. Then, why are you still here? A slow inhale, a ripple of movement. The mist curled tighter around the shape in front of him, but the eyes, those golden, ember-like eyes, never wavered. Because he failed, Ron's throat was dry. Because I am not bound by time the way you are. Because I am hunger, and hunger does not fade. The wind howled through the ruins, shaking the loose stones, sending leaves skittering across the damp ground. And now you have come. Ron's fingers flexed around his wand. The air around him felt thick, pressing inward, like the weight of the past was closing in. But he wasn't Gideon. And this time, it wouldn't end the same way. He squared his shoulders, forcing steel into his spine. I didn't come here to be taken, he said. I came here to finish what he started. The creature's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. Then movement, a ripple through the mist, a shift in the darkness, and then the low, rumbling words, "Then try, little flame." The mist asterisk exploded. The world shattered into motion. The mist surged, twisting into clawed tendrils that lashed toward Ron, thick as smoke, fast as striking vipers. He barely had time to react. His instincts kicked in before thought could catch up. His wand snapped up, his voice cutting through the air. Pratigo, a shimmering barrier erupted around him, the force of it colliding with the rushing darkness. The impact sent shockwaves rippling through the ruins, the stones beneath his feet groaning in protest. The mist recoiled, writhing like a living thing, but it did not retreat. It was asterisk testing him. Ron gritted his teeth, his muscles tensing. The golden eyes still burned through the fog, watching, waiting. Little flame, asterisk the voice rumbled, curling through his mind like smoke. Will you flicker out so quickly? Ron didn't answer. He had no breath to waste. The mist struck again, this time splitting into three, the first snaking low, aiming for his legs, the second coiling from above, a predator waiting to crush him, the third driving straight for his chest, fast and lethal. Ron moved. He twisted, dodging left, his wand cutting through the air. Expulso. A blast of force erupted from the tip, slamming into the shadowed tendril. The mist shrieked asterisk, as it was torn apart, curling away into nothingness. But the other two strands did not hesitate. The one below swept forward. Ron jumped, barely clearing it. But the moment his feet hit the ground, the second tendril snapped downward. Too fast. He raised his arm just in time to block it, but the impact hurt Asterisk. It wasn't solid, not entirely, but the force behind it was undeniable. It slammed him backward, sending him crashing into the ruins. His back struck cold stone, knocking the breath from his lungs. The mist did not wait. It surged forward, filling every inch of space, pressing inward, suffocating. Ron gasped, his fingers curling around his wand, even as his chest burned for air. The amulet was Asterisk boiling against his skin now, heat radiating outward, pulsing with something fierce, something that was not fear, not surrender, but defiance. Ron gritted his teeth. No, with a sharp jerk, he pressed his palm against the amulet, feeling its warmth seep into his skin, feeling the runes carve their way into his thoughts. And suddenly, he Asterisk knew Asterisk, a whisper not from the creature, but from something older Asterisk. A memory, an echo, something Gideon must have left behind, waiting for the next Weasley to reach this place. The fire is not in the spell. It is in the blood. Ron's breath hitched. His grip tightened around his wand. The mist closed in, and Ron let go, not of himself, not of the fight, but of his hesitation. The amulet flared, exploded with warmth, and Ron felt something inside him unlock. Magic surged, not just from his wand, but from somewhere deeper. Asterisk incendio. The flames erupted, not just from his spell, but from him. Fire didn't just spark, it Asterisk roared, twisting outward in waves, golden and wild, brighter than any flame he had ever cast before. It consumed the mist, searing through the tendrils, devouring the darkness. The creature screamed Asterisk. The golden eyes flickered Asterisk, not with pain, but with recognition. Ron didn't stop. He pressed forward, his wand a conduit, his magic pouring out in a way that had nothing to do with technique and everything to do with instinct. The ruins glowed with firelight. The mist burned away, and for the first time, the thing inside the shadows stepped back. The fire raged, a storm of gold and scarlet, twisting through the ruins, searing the mist into nothingness. Ron barely felt the heat. It was part of him now, pouring from his wand, from his hands, from the amulet that pulsed like a second heart against his chest. The darkness shrieked, curling away from the flames, twisting, retreating. And then the golden eyes blinked. For the first time, the presence before him did not feel like an unstoppable force, but something real Asterisk. Something that Asterisk could Asterisk be pushed back. Something that could be Asterisk ended Asterisk. Ron gritted his teeth, stepping forward. His boots scraped against the ancient stone. The fire still crackling around him. The weight of centuries pressed on his shoulders, but he didn't falter. "You took him," Ron said, his voice steady. "Strong, but you won't take me." The creature did not move. The golden eyes narrowed, unreadable, considering. And then asterisk, for the first time asterisk, it spoke in something other than thought. A voice, low, ancient, and almost tired. "You are not him." Ron's fingers curled tighter around his wand. "I know." Silence, then a shift in the air, deep, slow, like the world exhaling. "And yet you have come." Ron's heart pounded, but he didn't let himself step back. The creature watched him. The mist had thinned, the ruins now visible in the glow of the fatting fire. The golden eyes flickered, dimming slightly, no longer as bright as burning coals. "Then take what is yours." The amulet against Ron's chest, seared with heat, one last pulse of energy, rushing through him like a jolt of lightning. And the darkness let go. The mist collapsed inward, curling away, dissolving. The weight pressing against Ron's thoughts asterisk vanished asterisk. The golden eyes flickered once more, then closed, and the presence was gone. The ruins fell silent. Ron stood frozen, his breath coming in short bursts, the glow of the fire fatting around him. The air was still now, untouched, as if the village itself had been holding its breath for a century and had asterisk finally exhaled. He reached up, fingers brushing against the amulet. It was warm, still whole, but different, lighter, like its purpose had shifted. Ron swallowed, turning to look back toward Roth Farley. The village stood quiet in the distance, its streets empty, but no longer weighed down by something unseen. The story wasn't gone. It had just ended asterisk, and this time it hadn't been in failure. For the first time since he'd arrived, Ron felt something settle inside him. A certainty, quiet but strong. He had come looking for Gideon's story, but he had found his own asterisk. With one last look at the ruins, Ron squared his shoulders, turned, and walked away.